Alright guys, so this is the Photoshop tutorial. I'm Sean, and I'm going to be guiding you through this tutorial today. Um, so Photoshop, really cool tool. Essentially what we're going to be talking about today is how you take this image here, which is just an export from V-Ray render out of Rhino. It's just the raw render file. And I'm going to show you guys how you can take this render and turn it into this. And so really the whole point of this is, um, we have the render of our building here, but there's a lot of information that's missing. As someone who's looking at this image, we don't really understand what the context of this thing is. How are people using this space? What's the environment like? How does it sit in its landscape, its site, and its context? And what's happening around the building? And so by using Photoshop, of course, we can really create the environment that the building is sitting within, give it some character, add some life to it, and make it seem like it's something that is in existence, something that's believable and that people can buy into. Rendering is one of the most crucial parts of the project deliverables, and again, that's because in trying to sell your idea, people need to visualize it and they need to be able to understand what the product is that they're going to be getting, and the render is the best tool to show and convey that information. So it's really important that you guys know how to use Photoshop and how to use it to convey all of the information that is pertinent to your project. So what I'm going to do is, I think I'm going to break this tutorial up into 3 parts. The first part is just going to be an intro into Photoshop, just kind of a refresher, showing you guys which tools we're going to be using, the basic setup of Photoshop, and sort of the logic of how it works. And then the next portion is going to be about compositing, and by that I mean how do we bring in trees, the sky, people, animals, vegetation, stuff like that. Bring in these elements from other photos and place them into our render, size them correctly, and manipulate them as needed. And the third portion of the tutorial is going to be about post-processing or post-production, and that is really about how do we blend all of these elements together, make sure that they all have sort of the same color tones, the same lighting, and how we can use contrast and brightness to accent certain parts of the render. So let's start here. So first we're going to open up Photoshop. I already have mine open. You guys can open it now, and what you're going to be greeted with is this recent files menu, and it's just showing all of the files that have recently been opened in Photoshop. And this is just a tool to help you access files that you've been working on more quickly. You probably won't have much in here, I'm assuming, if you haven't been using Photoshop. But anyway, so this is what you're going to have first. But what we're going to do is we're going to come up here to File, and we're going to go to Open. And we're going to open up the render that came from Rhino. Here I have mine titled SVC Render 01, and we're going to select that and click Open. And it's going to open it up into Photoshop just like you see here. And I'm going to explain the general sort of setup of Photoshop and what we're going to be doing in here. So this is the Photoshop workspace. It is comprised of a series of menus, panels, and the central workspace, which is where our render is right here. Okay, starting up here at the top left, you have sort of your typical menu here. We're not really going to be using this a whole lot. And the reason being is really all the tools that we need to use are going to be on this left toolbar here and over here on the middle right portion of the screen where we have our adjustment layers and we have our layers panel. And so I guess jumping into this left menu, these are all the toolbars that we're going to be using. For the most part, we're just going to be using this polygon lasso tool. Yours is probably showing just the lasso tool right now. You can see, like in some of the other software, like in Rhino, there's this little triangle that shows you that you can expand this menu if you right-click on it. You can see here that there are a couple other lasso tool options, and we're going to be using the polygon lasso tool. The typical lasso tool is like a freehand drawing thing, and magnetic lasso sort of snaps to contrasting elements. And this polygon lasso is sort of like the polyline tool in Rhino, where you click endpoints on the screen to sort of make a complex shape. So that's what we're going to be using. We also have the crop tool here, magic wand, the eyedropper tool. The paintbrush, we're definitely going to be using this quite frequently. Pretty self-explanatory, the paintbrush. Once you select it and you come into your workspace here, if you right-click, you have this paintbrush menu, and you can see that there's a whole variety of paintbrushes. You can download more on the internet, you can make your own, and you can load a couple other presets in from Photoshop. You also have your size adjustment, which just adjusts the brush size. So you can see here 480 pixels. That's what the PX stands for. 63 super small. This hardness factor is talking about how soft or defined the edges of your paintbrush are. The higher the hardness number, the more defined the boundary is. So here you can see this circle has a very defined edge, and this paintbrush here with the hardness set to 0 has an extremely soft edge, so it allows you to blend things together. We're going to be using these grass paintbrushes pretty frequently for vegetation, but we'll get into that stuff later. The next tool we have here is the clone stamp tool. And essentially what this does is it lets us copy and paste parts of any image sort of in a way as if you were using those parts of an image as like a color with a paintbrush. So the clone stamp is sort of like a hybrid between copy and paste and the paintbrush tool. And we'll get into that later as well. That's pretty much what we're going to be using for the most part. There's a couple other tools here, the eraser tool, paint bucket, smudge, pen, text, some other selection tools, and polygon drawing tools. We're not really going to be using those. You can explore those other tools on your own. You might use them in different projects, but for what we're doing, we're not going to be using those. So you can also see here, just under our typical top menu here, we have this additional menu which corresponds to our left-hand tool set here. You can see it changes as I use different tools, and it is just providing extra adjustment for each of these tools. You can see here that they have this thing called a mode, and this is the mode allows you to essentially blend certain photos together in very calculated ways, like using the darker elements of one image to make the lighter elements of an image behind it pop out. It's a little bit complicated, but I can show you guys how that works in a bit. You have the opacity here, and opacity is just talking about the transparency of a color or of an object um, or an image. And the opacity, when it's set to a 100, means that it's completely solid and we can't see through it. The closer you get to 0, the more transparent that your image or color will become. Flow is talking about how smooth you're painting something. If you reduce the flow, it will be much more choppy. So here, for example, if I was to paint with this circle brush, let's unlock that guy. With the flow set to 100, it's this very smooth, continuous sort of shape that I've drawn here. If I set this flow to a much lower level, you will see that it's sort of adjusting the opacity in a way, but it's not laying down as much color as it would if the flow was at 100. So maybe you can think of it as like when you're gluing a model together, sort of the rate that the glue is coming out of the glue bottle. The lower the number, the slower it will come out, and the higher the number, the faster it will come out here. So, but we're not really going to be messing with this, and we're just going to leave it at 100 for what we're doing. Just the other things that we need to note here, over on the middle right hand screen you have your adjustment layers, and these are just adjustment tools that correspond to layers, and they use layers to make their adjustments. So we have a levels tool here, which we're going to be using. Essentially, this is the same as the brightness and contrast, but it adds a little bit more adjustability. We have hue and saturation, which we're going to be using as well, and this allows us to increase the vibrancy of colors and how much they stand out or reduce them. And you can also change the hue of colors, so changing a grouping of colors altogether. We're going to be using the color balance as well, which self-explanatory, allows you to adjust how much reds and blues, greens and yellows and purples are in an image. And that's probably all we're going to be using. We have a couple other options here like black and white, exposure. You have an invert adjustment layer, posterize, and a couple other things. Just below that you'll see we have the layers panel, and this is probably the most important thing in Photoshop, and this really is the basis of Photoshop. So Photoshop is a layer-based software, and how everything is organized is by layers, and how you adjust things and sort of which objects are in the foreground, which are in the background, and which one are in the midground, all correspond to this layering system. So you're going to be needing to pay quite a bit of attention to how things are organized, and which objects are on top of which ones are below different ones, so that you can see all of the elements, and so that your adjustment layers are working correctly. So for example here, I'm just going to open up the Photoshop file that I was working on. So you can see here under the layers panel, I have a series of groups which have grouped a number of different layers and objects inside of them. So you can see here under entourage there's a people folder, or a people group, and an animal group. The animals just have the geese over here, and the people of course have all of the people. Right, so things are organized very logically, and you guys should be striving to do the same thing. It's really important to be organized, because when you have this many layers, when things are not organized and grouped effectively, it can be pretty confusing about what is what, right? If you were to just look at this series of layers, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So it's really, really important that you organize your layers in a way that makes a lot of sense. Again, so talking a little bit more about layers, how things are organized, also stacked on top of each other, affects which objects we can see in the foreground and background. So for example here, this group 3, which I didn't do a good job of naming, but it corresponds to the sky in the background here. It's at the bottom of our layers, right? So you can sort of imagine your layers as a stack of papers. The papers that are at the bottom are the same as the layers that are at the bottom of this list, and the papers that are at the top are the same as the layers that are at the top of this list. So because I want this sky to be the background, we're going to place it at the bottom of our layers. So that way it's at the very back of the image. It's behind everything. Next, we have our building here, right? So you can see that our building is sort of in the middle ground. And then we have our vegetation, sort of in the foreground and the middle ground. And then the people and the animals that are sort of walking on top of that and walking on top of the building are at basically the top of our list. And then we have our post-production layer, which just uses some color blending to make things look alike and sort of enhance the image. So this is a pretty good example of what we're looking for you guys to produce. Maybe not quite to the amount of compositing that I've done here in terms of like how many different kinds of people and trees and animals and grass and stuff. But certainly how this thing is organized, we're looking for you guys to have a sky background, of course your building. We want to see some vegetation. You probably do need to have grass all in front of your building here. And we're looking for a couple trees and of course some people in here to really bring your render to life and show a bit of scale, so we can sort of understand the size of this project as well.